To this session. Can everyone hear me fine? Yeah, okay. So I'm delighted to introduce this panel, which brings a group of experts from various disciplines to help shed light on the factors that perpetuate gender-based discrimination, particularly against women, from the perspective of their own discipline. So we'll have two parts to the session. In the first part, we will have interventions from experts in philosophy, sociology, media studies, and psychology. After which we will take 10 minutes of Q&A. In the second session, we will have interventions from experts in public administration and business studies. So I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Fida Chehayeb, who is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham. Fida, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. First, let me just set up my Okay, so what I want to talk about today is a specific kind of discrimination that is what I call epistemic discrimination, and this constitutes a big part of my research. And what I want to do is sort of bring awareness to the kinds of epistemic phenomena that women and members of disempowered groups are, let's say, victims of discrimination. So for those who are not familiar with the word, epistemic refers to knowledge and knowing. And I'll be talking about two types of epistemic discrimination. Let me first start with a little anecdote, just to make things a bit concrete. So let's consider this incident. A group of men at a construction site are discussing the proper way to distribute the weight of an architectural structure evenly. And a woman intervenes and offers her solution, at which point a man looks and smiles condescendingly and says, "That's nice, but this is not home decor, this is a serious matter." Now this woman is the head architect at a leading firm here in Beirut, and she relayed this specific incident to me. Let's briefly analyze the kind of discrimination that this woman experienced. She was prevented basically from being recognized as a knower. She was prevented from being a knower and transmitting her knowledge. Essentially, she was denied as someone who can possess knowledge and transmit knowledge. Her testimony in the situation was ignored and dismissed because she was seen as less credible and less competent and less reliable. So this is a kind of discrimination that's based on gender that I want to talk about. It's also important to highlight the sort of harms that resulted from this kind of discrimination. So it's a kind of discrimination in testimony. It's due to the prejudice on the hearer's part. This woman was given a deflated her credibility was deflated. Her testimony was given less competence due to prejudice on the hearer's part to her testimony. And as a result, she was excluded from the community of epistemic trust. So again, the harms that resulted from this is that she felt that she was less confident in being a possessor, obtaining knowledge, possessing knowledge, and transmitting knowledge. And this sort of this undermined her capacity as someone who can be a true epistemic subject, and it's also undermined her capacity to reason, which is something essential for her very humanity. So this is a profound harm that she experienced, a humiliation in her very as a human being. She felt, humiliated because she was excluded and silence in that sense. Let me give another example, and I'm sure quite a few here may have experienced it, or at least, sorry? All right. Okay. Wow. I don't like this thing. Anyway, so I think this other example, quite a few of you may have experienced it or may have known someone who has experienced such a thing. So imagine a group of people in a boardroom or a classroom having a discussion. And one of the women raises her hands and offers a really good point, to which her point was not engaged with, it was not taken up, because the conversation went along as it had been even before she made her point. And shortly after, a man raises his hand and offers the exact same point, and it's actually taken up and considered and engaged with. So there's a rhetorical technique that some women have adopted. It's called amplification, and what it is basically if a woman gives a good point during a discussion, another woman or man repeats the point, gives credit to the originator in an attempt to amplify the voice and make sure that the point is not ignored or stolen. And going back to the discrimination, unless we forget the discrimination in testimony, lest we forget our very status as women in this country, where the personal status laws in certain sects, quite a few of them, in fact, where the testimony of a woman is worth half of that of a man. And essentially, the testimony of a woman is insufficient, and she's not seen as credible enough in the family court. And this is something that's important that we also need to look at and highlight. So it's not this kind of discriminatory reality is not only an experience that we have in our daily lives, but it's also something that's institutionalized and part of our judicial system. Going really quickly to my second type of discrimination that I want to talk about, and this is a discrimination against women in their attempts to gain interpretive understanding or interpretation of their own experiences. And as we just saw from the talk right before this one, with all the experts in the government and in law, there's a big there's a lack of definition basically for what it is of certain concepts that are gender related. For example, sexual harassment, and that's what was being discussed. And in a lot of in a large sense, women are not included. They're excluded from taking part in defining these matters that are very personal to them, and they are actually experts on these matters. I want to highlight really quickly the two types of the two concepts that are gender related that I think, I want to give as an example, that are not very well understood. They are kind of neglected from being defined. Marital rape, sexual harassment. There's a general disregard for these concepts, and they're met with a backlash against anyone who attempts to define them. A backlash that's manifested in condescending mockery. Essentially, there's, I think, a systematic and systemic strategy to keep such concepts obscure and muddled from the public understanding and from the collective understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Dr. Rima Majed, who is an assistant professor in sociology here at the American University of Beirut.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back, and my talk will be probably a bit more basic because it's very difficult to talk about gender and discrimination in 8 minutes. But I'll try to quickly highlight 4 points from the sociological literature that can help us think of the origins and causes of sexism, the title of this panel, in relation to gender discrimination and harassment more broadly, as this conference is trying to do. So first, one of the most important contributions of the discipline of sociology was the great effort at debunking the biological determinist argument that is often used to justify gender discrimination and to reinforce heterosexuality, heteronormativity. Gender discrimination is a structural issue. It is linked with broad economic, social, and political conditions that determine the power dynamics in society. So it's neither about biology nor about nature. Therefore, what we're talking about when we're talking about gender discrimination is really patriarchy. And what I'm trying to argue here is that we should have no shame, and we should use the word patriarchy more often, because it's like talking about poverty without mentioning capitalism. So we can't really talk about gender equality and gender discrimination and harassment without looking at it from a structural perspective. There is a structure that is generating these types of inequalities, and I think we should name it and shame it. So patriarchy is simply a system that generates a gender hierarchy whereby men have power over women in society. Although this system is often justified by biology and specifically by the reproductive role of women, and of course all these ideas about women being weak and being more emotional and etc., I think sociologists have done a great job and have long argued and shown that gender roles in society are a matter of socialization. So it's a matter of nurture and not nature. And therefore, there's nothing natural about gender discrimination. Now, if this division is not natural, then where does it come from? Although the exact origins of patriarchy and sexism are debatable, but I think a second important insight from sociology is the link between patriarchy as a system of exploitation and other systems of exploitation. So many sociological works have linked the origin of patriarchy to the origin of property, or the origin of marriage and family, or the origin of the division of labor in society. So for example, authors such as Engels, for example, explained that the origin of gender division started to take shape with the emergence of private properties and the subsequent class divisions. And he argues that women started to be perceived as private properties that can be acquired through marriage. And I mean, I don't have a lot of time, but if we just think of the Zaffi tradition in Lebanon, it's a great celebration of patriarchy. And probably this is why a lot of people become very emotional and cry. But I mean, it's literally patriarchy takes shape in our everyday life in so many little details. So the Zaffi is practically saying that the woman goes from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. However, regardless of the exact origins of patriarchy, sociologists have shown that the rise of capitalism and the subsequent wave of urbanization that followed had a huge impact on gender relationships in society, and specifically created a deeper entrenchment between the public and the private, which was at the core of the second wave of feminism. I think it's very important for us, if we're talking about patriarchy, about gender, to really think of it from a structural perspective, but to also think of it in terms of the private versus the public sphere. So with this division of labor that was based on gender, women were confined to their roles within the private sphere, so at home, and so as caregivers, whereas men were given the role of occupying the public, and therefore working outside and becoming the breadwinners. However, I mean, there's a lot of details we can go into here, but what I want to say here is that although we think of it as private versus public, but in reality, women have always worked. Throughout history, women have always worked, but it has been work either with no wage or with low wage. And it's with the economic crises that have pushed women to work, because men alone could no longer fulfill their role of being the sole breadwinners in families, that women have started to gain independence and have gained more education. And this has definitely changed the dynamics within the family, and we are seeing a lot of changes and advancements, of course, in women's roles in societies today, specifically in the public. And when I say in the public, it doesn't just mean, it's of course in economics and in the labor market, but it's also in the streets, it's also in politics. I mean, the public is very broad. And if we just think of the first half an hour when we wake up in the morning, we will understand what it means to say that patriarchy is a structure. I think the first half an hour in the morning of a woman and a man differs specifically when we want to get dressed and go to work. I mean, women always have to think about, where am I going to spend my day today? Can I wear a skirt or should I wear my pants? So I mean, things of, and I mean, speaking of harassment, because women bodies in the public the public sphere is considered to be the sphere of men. It's dominated by men. If a woman is raped at 3 a.m. in the morning, the first question is, what is she doing in the public, right? At that time, she should be in the private. So this division between public and private is very important. Okay, the fourth sociological insight I want to highlight here is that gender dynamics can only be understood from an intersectional perspective. And I'm saying this to say that women do not form a monolithic and homogeneous group in society. Their experiences differ based on their class, on their race, on their ethnicity, on their sexual orientation. So when we say today that women have started to work and are becoming more independent, of course we don't mean that they were not working, but that they are occupying better places and are having better jobs within the market. So this will... Okay, so I mean, despite all these very important changes that are happening in terms of gender roles in the public sphere and the market, the inequalities, huge inequalities still persist, and huge inequalities will keep on persisting as long as we are not addressing this as a structural problem. So this brings me back to my initial point about dismantling patriarchy rather than calling for just gender inequality. So in other words, I'm arguing that equality does not simply mean giving women the same rights as men in the workplace or in politics, but it rather means rethinking rights and roles in society and adjusting them to create an egalitarian society that does not discriminate or divide tasks based on gender or race or class. So the goal is not to give women the same rights as men, but rather to shake up the whole gender order in society. Thus, empowering women can only happen through fighting patriarchy, and fighting patriarchy can only happen through an intersectional feminist struggle that is able to link structural inequalities and fight discrimination and inequality as a whole. So to wrap this up, my sociological reading of gender dynamics has taught me that we need to talk about patriarchy and we need to fight it with feminism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rima. Our third speaker is Dr. Sara Mourad, who is an assistant professor in media studies, again here at AUB.
Hello. Thank you, Rima, for organizing the panel. So I think it's actually a nice flow from Rima's intervention to mine, because I'm going to be focusing on the private-public dichotomy as a feature that is at the core or root of patriarchy. So thank you for doing the kind of laying the ground for me. So when we think of the public sphere, and you mentioned, when you think it's not just about the workplace, it's not just about the state. When you think about the public sphere as a space for citizen engagement and association and participation, we know that we're talking about a highly masculinist sphere. The very conceptualization of the public sphere as public relied on its opposition to a private realm of affairs, which is the domestic or the familial realm, and this is where women have been historically relegated. And obviously this has, when we think about the history of that division, we also think about, that separation at the core of the history of capitalism, in the sense of the division of labor, that is at the core of society, which is who's doing the housework, who's doing the labor of reproduction itself, So who's producing the humans who would be the laborers, the workers of the future, and who's raising these children. So that division, when we think about patriarchy, we cannot dismiss it as a central one in terms of holding women in their place, and in their place here meaning in their reproductive and familial function. So when we now think about the public sphere, this is where citizens come to deliberate issues of public concern, but also where they come to maybe formulate discourses that are critical of the state. So it's that space that is between the state, between the market economy, between the private familial sphere, that theorists have attempted to describe for us, especially in their elaboration of or thinking about democracy. So the public sphere becomes a vital feature of democratic societies. Without the public sphere and the deliberation that takes shape there, our democratic politics are necessarily compromised. So bearing this in mind, what does it mean for, one, women to be excluded from the public sphere, and not necessarily in formal ways, we're talking here about informal exclusions, but also what does it mean for women's affairs or women's issues to be relegated to the private sphere or to the private realm. And this is, I think, at the core of the reproduction of patriarchal social orders is the fact that we don't talk about things like domestic violence, like sexual harassment, like marital rape, because these are private issues. And we've seen this in the context of Lebanon, we've seen this over the past few years because of the wave of feminist activism that has really galvanized the public sphere, at least since 2005, within NGOs, within different collectives, feminist collectives, and social movements that have actively tried to publicize the previously, what was previously thought as the private affairs. And here we can think of the campaign to basically draft and the law around the criminalization of domestic violence, which starts roughly around 2009. And one of the famous responses that we've heard back then was from one of the MPs, Imad al-Hout, who said around the controversy of whether or not we should criminalize something like marital rape, but there is no such thing as rape between a man and a husband and his wife. And this was, reiterated by, highly ranked politicians and public officials who claim that we can never really know what happens behind closed doors. So really, instead of thinking about, how can we actually start intervening and fixing what is happening behind closed doors, we take this as a fait accompli, as the natural state of affairs. We cannot intervene in the privacy of the domestic household. And so when we claim that that state of natural non-intervention, we're actually reinforcing the power dynamics that are taking shape primarily in these households. So when we think about gender dynamics as we witness them in society at large, when we think about the power relationships or the power psychology of dominance and submission that we see in the workplace, so something like sexual harassment is based on that power psychology of dominance and submission, and who is the dominant party and who is the submissive one. So we see it in the workplace, we see it in the political sphere, and so if we really want to tackle it, we need to go to the heart of where that power psychology is primarily enacted and reinforced, which is in the domestic household. Not only between the husband and the wife, but also between the father and the children. So thinking about power relationships between the conjugal couple, but also within the family, the nuclear family itself, as a sphere of power. And so here I will maybe that's the kind of the negative side of it. To look at the more positive side of it, what has been done in order to counter that exclusion from the public of subordinated groups such as women, but also of affairs that are seen as too private. We have the emergence of counter-publics, and this is where members of subordinated groups come together, they formulate, they create discourses that reinterpret social reality. So when we talk about sexual harassment, when we talk about marital rape or early marriage or child marriage, and we've seen the recent controversy with, Hassan Nasrallah's speech responding directly to recent attempts to counter or to change how we perceive such a normal social, dynamic, which is or phenomenon, which is early marriage, because precisely the reinterpretation of social reality is at core of redefining that social reality in order to be able to change it. So these groups, I think, in the context of Lebanon, have played a really significant role to make previously private issues into ones that are contestable in public, ones that are legible in public, that are maybe even subject to legislation. Not that legislation is always the only way to make something public. And I think this is where their emancipatory potential lies, in making previously unavailable categories of thought, like also something like the double shift, for instance, to go back to this idea of women always working. So these are not part of our common sense, and the first attempt to try to dismantle the patriarchy, I think, is to start creating discourses, but also circulating them and making them more legible in public. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Our fourth speaker is actually myself. So my name is Rima Saab. I'm a social psychologist here at AUB. So I'll be talking about sexism from a social psychological perspective. Right, so social psychological research on sexism started in the 1970s, and many mechanisms have been researched. Two of the most widely researched mechanisms are ambivalent sexism and stereotype threat, which I will be addressing today. So we'll start with ambivalent sexism. When we think of the stereotypical image of a sexist man, we often think of a very negative behavior, such as physical or emotional abuse by a man towards a woman, or men explicitly belittling women's competence. Now, what ambivalent sexism theory argues is that in order to maintain male dominance in society, it is necessary to do two things. On one hand, we have to punish women who challenge male dominance, so that would be feminists, career women, sexually liberal women. But on the other hand, it is equally important to reward and idealize women who adopt traditional gender roles and submit to male dominance. So, what ambivalent sexism theory proposes is that there are actually two kinds of sexism: hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism is called as such because it involves overtly hostile behaviors towards women. So it involves holding the view that women seek to dominate men when they're actually asking for equal rights. They seek to dominate men, and that women are sexually manipulative and cannot be trusted. So items on a hostile sexism scale would read as such: once a woman gets a man to commit to her, she usually tries to put him on a tight leash. Women seek to gain power by getting control over men. Benevolent sexism, on the other hand, is called benevolent because it involves seemingly more positive behaviors towards women. So it involves holding the view that women are pure and sensitive creatures that should be cherished and adored. So items on a benevolent sexism scale would read as such: many women have a quality of purity that few men possess. Men should be willing to sacrifice their own well-being in order to provide financially for the women in their lives. A good woman should be set on a pedestal by her man. Now, although these statements may seem positive, they actually indicate a paternalistic kind of prejudice, because they imply that women are weak and in need of protection. And the same qualities of purity, sensitivity, and fragility which justify putting women on a pedestal are also used to justify why women are not capable and should not have the same rights as men. So, in a sense, it is much easier to tell women not to pursue a career because women simply excel at childcare than to tell them women are not competent enough. So they both achieve the same objective, but you can see that casting the message in a more positive way can be more effective. So what the theory argues is that hostile and benevolent sexism are actually two sides of the same coin, hence the term ambivalent sexism. And note that they can be endorsed and perpetuated by both men and women, and they both feed into gender inequality. The existence of these two separate but related kinds of sexism has been demonstrated across various nations spanning all 5 continents, including in our countries in this region, Turkey and Lebanon. And what research has found is that hostile and benevolent sexism tend to correlate positively. And the greater the average level of hostile sexism of a nation, the greater its level of benevolent sexism, indicating that the two ideologies are really mutually reinforcing each other. Now, is benevolent sexism really about protecting women? What does research have to say about that? Benevolently sexist men are not more likely to oppose early marriages for girls, they are not more likely to oppose sexual harassment, and they are not more likely to reject wife abuse. Benevolent sexism also involves dangers to women. Leading women to expect benevolent sexism at work seems to undermine their performance. Exposing women to benevolent sexism seems to undermine their inclination to fight sexism through collective action. What's also particularly dangerous about benevolent sexism is that women tend to view it as less harmful than hostile sexism, and they underestimate the possibility that both benevolent and hostile sexism can occur in the same man. So one of the things that makes sexism really hard to combat is that it is maintained by seemingly positive behaviors towards women, which are harder to recognize as discrimination. So perhaps one way to remember, one thing to keep in mind is that benevolent sexism can be shortened to BS. The next phenomenon I'll talk about is stereotype threat. We know that women are typically underrepresented in domains relating to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, known as the STEM subjects. Incidentally, these are also typically higher paying jobs. We also know that women tend to be underrepresented in the political domain, and these two realities co-occur with two widely held stereotypes, which are that girls are good at maths and women make less effective political leaders than men, which are used to justify the underrepresentation of women in these domains. So one of the important questions to ask here is, could these stereotypes actually contribute to the low presence and underperformance of women in certain domains? And the research suggests that this is the case. So stereotype threat is a phenomenon that occurs when a woman has to perform a certain task where men are stereotypically believed to do better than men. Now, this situation puts her at risk of confirming the negative stereotype about her group, and this anxiety can actually lead her to underperform. So in a typical experiment on stereotype threat in the domain of mathematics, for example, you get a group of female students and you randomly assign them to a stereotype threat group where you implicitly or explicitly remind the women about the stereotype that girls are poor at math. And in the control group, you make no reminders of such a stereotype. Math performance is assessed afterwards, and what many studies have shown is that women typically underperform in the stereotype threat condition compared to the control condition. Now, stereotype threat experiments have been done in various domains, and what the studies consistently show is that women exhibit poor performance in response to stereotype threat in the domains of math, athletics, negotiation, political leadership, and driving. What's particularly dangerous about stereotype threat is that it leads women to have a reduced sense of belonging to the stereotype domain. So women feel like they belong less to the domain of science or leadership. They show reduced interest and lower inclination to pursue professions in the stereotype domain. And what's also particularly dangerous is that stereotype threat can lead to underperformance even when the woman does not actually endorse the negative stereotype about her group, and even when she endorses it only subconsciously, so without actually being aware of it. So, in a nutshell, women's lower presence and underperformance in certain male-dominated areas is at least partially due to the perpetuation of negative stereotypes about women's abilities rather than the accuracy of these stereotypes. So, there's various solutions that have been proposed based on research. I'll just highlight two here. Raising awareness about stereotype threat and its effects on underperformance has been shown to help protect against its effects. And providing successful role models as a way to combat negative stereotypes is, of course, also one way to go. Thank you very much. So we'll actually have a 10-minute Q&A session before we move on to the second half of the of the panel. Any questions so far? Any questions to the panelists? Yes?
Hi. My name is Wafa. I'm sorry, I am a woman, but I'm new to the domain. I've had my issues of gendering while becoming a career woman. That's a different story. I have one question, and please don't be upset with me.
It's out of ignorance, it's not out of, if it sounds inappropriate. Why is it always that this issue is approached from a victim perspective? Why is it always that the society, the men, the whatever, are causing this state? What about the role of women in making women an equal partner in society? Why don't we hear a lot about that? When you look around, you find that it's the women that are perpetuating their roles, more than the men sometimes. I don't know, this is my perspective. I am quite old in comparison to the people in this room, so this is out of experience in real life, really. That's my only question.
We have another question.
Okay, hello, thank you for this. I really have a personal question, and I do mean it, okay? So it's not an academic. I recently gave a workshop for women in entry-level positions to prep them for the types of challenges that they might face at the workplace. And I was approached by a faculty member afterwards who gave me the advice that I should stop helping these young women try to ask for equality, which I wasn't. And that I were to talk instead about, family-friendly policies, such as being able to breastfeed in the office, etc., etc. As this faculty member was speaking to me, I did find that my sympathetic nervous system was activated, and I really felt like I wanted to express something, and I did so very diplomatically, and I was very happy with that. And I still got, you're being aggressive, you're being defensive right now. And so when I was trying to figure out how to deal with this situation in my head, and afterwards when I sought mentorship from a female role model, I was given the advice that, no, you should just ignore this and it's okay because he's trying to get a rise out of you. And so that puts you in a position where if you do try to woman-splain why this is actually wrong, what you're saying, you are actually reinforcing what in that person's head is the basic idea that you are defensive, you are emotional. And if you actually do take that, I'm going to call it a defense mechanism or whatever it is, if you take the attitude of, yeah, it's okay, thank you for your advice, and please email me your, I would love to hear about your contributions, etc. And if I take that, I'm also reinforcing the idea that, you should just shut up, they don't know any better, or what have you. So I really do want professional advice on how to deal with such manners, especially when there's much to lose when it comes to connections or what have you.
Any other questions?
I don't know, maybe it's early and you're going to cover this later on, but I hope you do. We saw how normally this happened, sexism, how it happened. I wonder why in such a country such as Lebanon, true, we're talking laws and we're talking women reinforcement, but I don't know if it's because it's politically correct or incorrect. Why don't we talk religion? Because I don't think there is any real cause for real sexism that doesn't come from there too. I mean, when we were talking about putting a woman on a higher state and she's to be idled and she's, that's the Virgin Mary, or Fatima Zahra, or whoever you want to call it. So we have throughout religion this kind of attitude where patriarchy has been and will always be. Now in a country such as Lebanon that is that divided on a religious level, what can we do?
think maybe we'll stop here for now. Okay, very quick question.
Please.
We need a guy to ask a question.
Well, since we're sharing personal experiences, and I want to be a feminist man. My wife has started producing laborers recently, and I don't really know how to be a feminist. I don't know how to approach her. I don't know if putting her on a pedestal at this point is something that's patriarchal or actually feminist. It's really confusing to me, honestly. I honestly want to be, because I'm not interested. It's not about interest. It's a passion for me. I want to be one of the people that actually promote and perpetuate equality between men and women. And I want to live that. But honestly, I don't know how to do that, because everything that I do seems to me that it's not feminist. Especially now, with the situation that we have at home. At some point, I believe that maybe my wife needs to have a longer maternity leave than she actually does have now. But then again, I say maybe that's not really feminist. Maybe I should take part. And what about breastfeeding? It's the most complicated thing about everything that we're going through now. Because I want to share every moment with her, but this is something that I can do. And it creates this real division between what I can provide and what she can provide, and it gives her an advantage towards the child. And it's something that I really think about. And maybe this is something that, when we talk about the division of roles, this is something to consider. There are things that I can't do, and I really don't know how to react and how to approach her at this point, with, keeping in mind that I want to do that from a feminist perspective, not a feminist perspective, just wanting to be equal with her in this example.
Thank you very much. I think we will have time for questions at the end, so you can always bring them up. We still have another list of panelists. So I will open the floor to the...
So that we can all answer. I think the question of women against women, when we talk about patriarchy, we're not only talking about men against women, we're also talking about how that as a structure perpetuates certain power dynamics even between women. So that, for instance, you see this in the different life cycles in women's lives, where you have the, take the Hamed, for example, and her daughter-in-law, or like the relationship between the mother and the daughter, where the older the woman gets, the more capital she seems to have, and so she feels that she needs to exercise she has the right now to exercise some form of power. So you have that. You also have, to address that question, we should also think of intersectionality here as crucial, because women, upper class women, are abusive to working class women, and the relationship dynamics between the women of the household and their migrant domestic workers is a perfect example of that, how women can actually perpetuate both patriarchal dynamics and infantilizing the women who work for them, but also can perpetuate racist power dynamics based on the race or the ethnicity and the class of the other women. So it's not just a question of gender, it's also a question of other aspects of women's identities and women's perceived need to exercise power over other women in order to get more, capital or privileges or respect from other people. And you see this in the workplace too. For the religious question, I think what we can do is tackle personal status laws. I think, we have all these, we think that, we have all these different laws regulating women's and family lives in the different personal status laws that we have. And I think one way to start thinking about this is one way to divide us as women, but also to perpetuate the discrimination and disenfranchisement that we suffer from. And so, in terms of fighting religious discourses and laws, I think fighting for a civil personal status law is the way to start. And the question of speak out or shut up, this is the the stereotype of the feminist killjoy, of the woman who's always angry, and I think, I mean, my reaction is no, don't shut up, but there are ways maybe to, because you're afraid of losing connections. It's about being strategic and how you're educating that other person, because you are essentially educating them. And so no, never let it go or drop it, because I don't think that's productive, but be strategic.
Thank you, Sara. So you replied to some of it. I mean, you said some of the things I wanted to say. So the question of women against women, I think thinking of it in terms of structures of patriarchy is more helpful here. Of course, I mean, there are many movements and feminist movements that bring women together. But also we should not forget.
Sorry, Rima, we'll just have a very quick 1 minute, and then we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just the question. So I'll just say a few words about being a man and wanting to be feminist, which is totally possible. But the one thing that I wanted to say is that it's a matter of positionality as well. So it's, I mean, bringing it down. It doesn't only boil down to biology at the end. And yes, you cannot breastfeed as a man, although we can debate that maybe you can if we drop the gender binaries. But there are many other things that you can do. And here it's more shifting the roles in terms of thinking of them either as biological roles or as rights. And what I would like to say is that what we should shift is expectations. We should drop the expectation, or one way to fight patriarchy is trying to change this expectation that women have certain roles to fulfill and men have other roles to fulfill. And of course, this is more complicated than what we think. It's a structure, it's a double burden. We didn't have time to talk about it a lot, but today women have two shifts. They work. I mean, saying that we want to give them the right to work means that we're practically making their lives even more difficult while we're not adjusting for the expectations that women have at home. So one way to think about it is not for her to have a longer maternity leave, it's probably for you to have a paternity leave.
So thank you very much, Rima. Sorry to interrupt you. So we'll move on to the next speaker. Please remember, we will have more time for Q&As afterwards. Our next speaker is Dr. Carmen Geha, who is an assistant professor in public administration here at AUB.
Right, good morning, and thank you so much, Lee, for organizing and coordinating. Like Wafa, I'm new to this. I'm a political studies, public administration, and I'm really humbled to be among colleagues whose areas of expertise is gender, and I'm coming at it from a political perspective. So my work is on why the administration behaves the way it does with women as a subfield of my interest. So I'm coming at it from politics. And I had a lot of quotes prepared, but the speaker, the advisor to Oga Safia, I don't know if you heard the lawyer in the morning, read something. I'll quote, in public administration, he says, it's really difficult to hold somebody accountable. They tend to stick together. So, women can't really come and say that they've been sexually harassed. And I want to say that administration is an embodiment of the political system, right? It's the embodiment of political will. So why do we have religious laws? Why is our administration corrupt? Why are there more women in judiciary and not in parliament? So I'm coming at it from this perspective. What is the link between the political system? What is political sexism for the case of Lebanon? And we literally just completed a study of around 120 women, and biographical. These are women in the public sector, so I'm still transcribing, and I want to share a little bit on aspects of political/public administration sexism in Lebanon, and I would love to hear your views on that. So just the question, so Lebanon is a sectarian power sharing system. It has long favored men in representation. I mean, this is not a we might be more sophisticated as to how we are upset about it because we've developed a jargon. But this is a historic issue. Women were not at the table when the Ottomans decided to instate a milli system, and this is the source of our courts. And women were not at the table when the French left and the two famous men decided to have an agreement. And women were not at the table in Ta'if, women are not at the table in the Doha agreement. And there's a whole literature on what happens when women are absent from conflict, post-conflict agreements. So this is a long term, and everywhere you look there are women. Even our Minister for Women Issues is a man. Until recently, the Executive Secretary of the National Commission for Lebanese Women was a man. Okay, so what explains women's underrepresentation in national politics? Also, what makes this system so masculine? Like, why is it? Are men inherently are they just bad people? Are they, are we weak? Like, what is it? So where are they? So that's really the question. And in my work, in my book, I trace how Lebanon evolved along 6 junctures. I won't go into that, but I'll just show you a picture. So men fighters, men in the parliament, and men at the national dialogue table. I just want to say that this means that formally, informally, so it's male. So national dialogue table is not a formal institution. Parliament is the fighting scheme, and this has exhibited 4 key things: male-dominated agreements to divide power, enshrined patron-client relations. So the parliament is a private club. Religious courts favor men in all aspects and personal status issues, and a male-dominated media, both in representation and in content. There is what I'm trying to call informal political sexism now. Informal can be defined in various ways, but I'm not looking at it from a legal, structural way. Okay, this is neo-institutionalism. What are the ideational things that we are exhibiting to women? So there are 4 key findings in the study. So number 1, it's sexist in its inaccessibility to women. Okay? Sexism in the political sense means women have less access to power and decision making. She's not where things are being decided. She's not where things are being decided. That's it. She's not there. She has no access to it. For example, and this is from a judge, not only am I not sitting on the table, she says, unlike a male colleague, I can't go in and knock on my boss and say, can we have a dinner, to discuss work? Do you mind if I take you out for a coffee? I'm having this issue, I have a difficult client. She doesn't have the same access, whereas men, right? So she's not, she's shy, she's not shy, she's strong, but she doesn't know how to reply. What Simin is saying, should I just hug him and be bro, welcome to sex? What should I do? So I don't have access, right? And a woman as senior as a judge says, I can't go into the minister's room and say, hey, we want to talk about this. Number 2, it's sexist favoritism. So men are preferred to be electoral candidates, and many people in the room, this. So the woman is told, wait, it's not your turn. Dire quote, I'm repeatedly told it's not my turn. Perhaps one day when my uncle dies, I could run for municipal elections. This is the municipality. The lady wants to volunteer to be on the municipal council. She's not paid to be on the municipal council. She's got to wait for her uncle to die. Okay, sexist roles. So political parties, for example, media and other, but mainly political parties, have restricted the role to women into a single branch that caters for women activities. So all political parties have women councils, have a branch for women. They do, breakfasts and fundraisers. And this is a woman in a political party. I think it's a mistake to have women on council in our parties. What we need is more women in the political council of the party, right? Sexist policies, so again, this, women cannot pass nationalities, they earn less than men, they're least promoted in the private sector. A woman at a ministry, direct quote, whenever there's an opportunity for travel and advancement, it's always the men who get it. So 4 aspects of sexism: inaccessibility, favoritism, the role that she has to play in politics, and policies that structurally do this. These are systemic sexism as a driver of patriarchy. Some things in our system make this very conducive. I just wanted to raise this. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist. I'm saying politically, when consensus-based decision-making is the core of political agreement, like national dialogue, things like that, if it's secretive, it lends itself favorable towards men. If elections are clientelistic, it lends themselves favorable towards men. If it costs so much to have a political career, time and money in Lebanon, men and women have to pay to get on an election ticket, so she is at a disadvantage. So all of these drivers that we call of sexism are drivers of patriarchy. Just quickly, because the idea was to bring in a political perspective and the need for intersectionality, I agree with my colleagues, of course. Just one word on academia policy. and practical spheres. Like, where are we now? And again, this is part of a larger study. So academically, literature recognizes that power-sharing agreements in post-conflict that leave out women. We know this. This is not only for Lebanon, Northern Ireland, Burundi, and others. Power-sharing that's based on ethno-nationalism, so sectarian in the Lebanon case, creates a lock-in effect. So her identity, gender identities are less important. We need to protect the Christians. We need to protect the Druze. We need to protect minorities. We'll talk about women later. So whenever power-sharing is ethno-nationalist, women are not favored. And power-sharing agreements that are forged by men tend to require men's approval to undertake reform. So this is academic knowledge. Policy overview, woman dying, Hassan Nasrallah on International Women's Day a week ago, same-child marriage is Haida, and then the picture, I think Kafa did this. So I won't, sorry, I won't say more. So are we okay with the policy sphere? We're all plugged in. Practically, so in the research, again, we talked to a lot of women that attended a lot of these capacity building programs, and so there's donor reductionism. They focus on skill building for women, framing it as a problem of women lack of capacity because women don't know how to talk in public. That's why they're not in office, because women aren't smart. They don't know how to do a budget. Demands for a quota in parliament is important, but it can be co-opted and used as an oversimplification to respond to demands by feminist groups. This is not what the feminist groups, the women groups, the researchers are saying. Quota is only one aspect, there's other things. And feminist movements have threefold focus, so we do a typology in the study. What explains women's underrepresentation in politics? Sexism turns national politics into being aggressive and masculine. Traditional gender roles make a political career not feasible. Policy outcomes, because of religious sports and others, discriminate, and decisions. I just want to close with this picture, please, Rima. So even if she wants to appeal for reform, she has to have a male approval for that reform, and I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to swap. Our next speaker is Dr. Fida Afiouni, who is an associate professor in human resource management at the Alayan School of Business at AUB.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rima, for the panel. I'm very happy to be speaking after our panelists because I'm going to be tapping on many of the concepts that they already tackled. As you know, business is a recent discipline. I'm an associate professor in human resource management. And in business, as a new social science discipline, we borrow on a lot of concepts from neighboring disciplines, namely sociology, psychology, social psychology, etc. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show 4 mechanisms that are applied in organizations that lead to sexism and inequality, drawing on concepts such as patriarchies, hidden bias, masculinities that we talked about. And I hope to be answering some of your questions here that are specifically tied to organizations. Why is it important that we talk about sexism in organizations? Because research shows that organizations benefit from having diversity. Actually, the firm value increases as the number of women on board increases, and there are many other advantages that unfortunately we don't have time to go in. However, when we look at statistics, we see that there are consistent gender differences in terms of pay, in terms of career development, promotion prospects, etc. Therefore, what happens is women who feel undervalued at work will reevaluate their priorities and perhaps give priority more to family. So we see that what happens in organizations is this vicious circle that reinforces itself, where the more we discriminate against women, the more women feel that work is not worth it and give priority to the private sphere. So the question is, why do we have this? Is it about the women? Is it that women really have less ambitions or not that interested in having a career, and they are really prefer to spend their time with their families instead of their co-workers? Or is it something about the organizations? Do they favor males over females? The jargon in business, we have glass ceiling, that's the jargon we use the most, but also very new jargons such as sticky floors, where women are stuck at low-level positions, leaky pipeline, where women start at the age of 30, the time where they are founding their families to leak out of the workplace, and also, maternal wall, where women hit some walls they cannot move because of the motherhood penalty that they face. So the answer is, it's not really the women, it's not only organizations, both usually reinforce themselves through the four mechanisms that I'm going to talk about. Something very ironic is, we conduct research with organizations and we ask them, do you have in place diversity policies? They say no, it's about merit. We do not differentiate between men and women. Those who have the, on merit, they get the promotion and the money, etc. However, research shows that even companies that have merit systems, we see a lot of gaps in terms of pay, promotion, prospects, etc. And what's even more ironic, in companies who do not use merit, the bias still exists. So the question is why we have this paradox of equality in organizations. There is two sides of the coins. There's on one side what organizations value, and from what we heard from our speakers, it's clear that they value masculinities. And there's on the other side the people's behavioral preferences. So if you are a man or a woman and you are in a highly masculine organizations, if you behave in a masculine way, you are going to be rewarded and promoted and have salary increases. But if you behave in a feminine way, you are going to be penalized. So through the four mechanisms that we'll quickly go through, we'll see how the behavior of the person and the expectations of the organizations lead to this kind of limited career prospects and gaps. So I'm going to talk about four mechanisms. The implicit bias that Fida tackled a little bit from an epistemological perspective. The glass cliff, where women are put in leadership positions and then pushed down for failure. The green bee that would answer the question that we had in the audience is why is it that women do not help other women in organizations, and some work-family issues where for women it's an either-or question. Being aware of these mechanisms is key for women and organizations to address the problem. So speaking about the first one, and this addresses perhaps Sinin or Carmen, there are some expectations that women are going to be feminine, have higher socio-emotional skills, and men are naturally associated with careers and assertiveness, and women with more family and nurturing. And this leads to lack of fit perception, that women do not really fit certain jobs that require a lot of strength or that are masculine in nature. So although expecting a woman, to be nurturing, to have social skills, and to dress in a feminine way could be kind of, benign, it's not something of a big deal. It could be really harmful for women. And the example of Anne Hopkins, who was denied a partnership in the firm just because she wasn't dressed in a feminine way, and there were sarcastic jokes about her that she should go to charm school. She went to court and she won based on implicit bias discrimination. The studies do confirm that this bias leads to lower success, lower performance, high turnover, but also some health issues and psychological health issues. So this leads to really this self-fulfilling cycle of withdrawal and performance failure, and this prevents women from even thinking of going into certain jobs or certain positions in organizations. Another, and I'm going to go quickly for the sake of time, a glass cliff is really something very, very dangerous, because we associate, think manager, think maid. Usually males are in leadership positions. However, interestingly, when there is a crisis, we tend to put women in this leadership position because of her social and nurturing emotional skills. So when there is a lot to lose and not a lot to gain, when there is this critical position, we put women. And what happens is, for example, lawyers are assigned cases that are very hard to win. Politicians are put in seats that are very hard to win. So we are preparing women for failure in leadership positions because we rely on their, stereotypically people skills. So we put them in leadership position. It's hard for them to succeed. And if they are smart enough to know that this is not winnable and decline the position, this reconfirms the stereotype that women really are not up for leadership positions and they opt out of leadership positions. The third mechanism that answers your question is the queen bee. So we see that women make it to the top. However, very few make it. 5% of CEOs are women. They make it the hard way. So what they do is they want to differentiate themselves from the other women, and they become very masculine in terms of career ambition. They are the ones who lobby against any gender equality mechanism and policy and family-friendly policies in organizations because they made it the tough way. They tend to attribute that to their own success, and therefore they do not help the junior, and they do not support any initiative in the organization that is aimed at equality for organizations. So women are their own worst enemies sometimes. However, just for the sake of clarification, the queen bee effect only manifests itself because women have experienced this implicit bias and discrimination in the workplace and have to distance themselves from that. And I'm going to stop here for the sake of time.
Thank you very much. So our last speaker is Dr. Beverly Dawn Mitkov, who is a visiting associate professor in international management from Manchester University, and she is from here at the Arayan School of Business at AUB.
Thank you, everybody. Is that working? Oh, can everybody hear me okay? I want to follow on and make some points that build upon some of the commentary so far. I'm very interested in how equality is going to be mapped out in the late stages of neo-capitalism and neoliberalism. And I'll be highlighting this in relation to women's leadership. And so I don't want to ground it just in Lebanon. I want to open it up and examine opportunities or constraints that are happening in the global economy. And there is a handout, actually, that's going around, because I don't think you can see it very well on the slide. So people already have highlighted that there are global inequalities. And this manifests itself in terms of limited resources for women, limited access to opportunities, limited role in political decision-making or corporate decision-making. And there are embedded cultural restraints, and I mean organisational culture and societal culture, but there are also structural constraints that prevent women from accessing many roles in the political sphere, but also in senior leadership roles worldwide. And I'm not really going to go into detail on leadership theory. There is a mass of leadership that highlights think manager, think male, and that's also been reaffirmed when we look at the global picture. So, think manager, think global, and again, it's about thinking within a masculinist paradigm. I want to re-emphasise the importance of patriarchy. I want to link that to this idea of hegemonic masculinity. That is, the qualities and role of a man within many social systems privilege men's capabilities and skills, and therefore there is a gendered hierarchy created. Women, therefore, are judged against a masculinist capital that many people have bought into and are socialised into in every type of social system. But it's not something that also undermines women. It's also something that undermines other people who don't live up to the ideals of a tough, aggressive, heterosexual male. And here, it is important to highlight the limited opportunities for men who may be homosexual, or for other women who are from ethnic minorities or religious minorities. In essence, if you're not a white heterosexual male, you are lacking when you're looking at the global economy. So this is the diagram I've comprised, which is really looking at what are the barriers that really are at play, especially within the Middle East context. And you can see that they're very much about tribal origins, but also we think about the networks. Think about WASTA. WASTA is very much a masculinized network. Patriarchy, we've already mentioned. Government policy or lack of government policy. Do you want quotas? Do you think governments should, what's the word? Do you think there should be legislation for quotas for women? External market conditions. We know when we have tough labour markets, tight labour markets, women's opportunities are limited. And also, we've got to think about the personal motivations of women aspiring to leadership roles. Women are not given the opportunities. Private sector practices. Within the Middle East, many opportunities are reserved for men. Training budgets are reserved for men. And I've added this dimension here, civil society and women's organisations, especially in Lebanon. If it wasn't for these organisations, many women wouldn't be able to participate in the labour market or political sphere at all. I'm going to move on from that. I want us to think about hierarchies of participation, hierarchies of visibility, hierarchies of involvement. So we need to think about global governance. When we look at international organisations like the UN, the ILO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, those leaders who are in charge of strategic decisions for how global governance should be organised are primarily men, whereas the women are taking roles that focus on social policy and social development. Let's look at governance in terms of comparing government representation worldwide. We know it's not brilliant in Lebanon. Can anybody tell me which country has got the most women in its parliament?
Canada has equal representation.
Rwanda. Yeah, it's always a surprise. Organisation level. The reason why I wanted us to think global is to really think about how can we make sense of what is going to happen in the late stages of capitalism. We have got lots of different political systems in the world. We've got communist, we've got social democratic, we've got capitalist, and where are the women? They're being excluded. If you go to China, communist system, you can only get into parliament if you are a member of the Chinese Communist Party. But only 23% of women in China are members of the Chinese Communist Party. Where is the resistance globally tackling these inequalities in consideration of the fact that Xi Jinping was the one that hosted the gender goals in 27th of September last year in the United Nations in the USA. He is not pushing forward the gender or equality debate. I want to highlight the importance of intersectionality. We need to think of a variety of differences. We need to think about ethnicity, we need to think about religion, we need to think about gender, sexuality. And all of these are multiple factors shaping different identities. And I'd like us to stress the importance of multiple feminisms. Latin American feminism, Islamic feminisms, African feminisms. We need to consider how they are playing out. And I'm sure some of you know who those people are in that picture. Let's look at the global empowerment measure for economic, political, education and health. Lebanon is 135, 2016 figures, overall. So the global gender gap is very, very severe, and all the Middle East states are within the lower quartile. But let's look again, this is really worrying, because it's 144 countries who participate in this. Lebanon, 143, Yemen is 144, education, economic participation and opportunity. It's a really bad picture. I'll end with that. I think we need to think at different dimensions of representation, and we need to think of how the global links to the local, and absolutely we need to think about transnational feminist networks in order to organise and promote women's participation and those that don't live up to the ideal of hegemonic masculinity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all our panelists. We just have a couple of minutes for questions, unfortunately. So we'll take a couple of questions.
Okay. Hello. Thank you everybody for your wonderful input. As the panel is called The Origins and Causes of Sexism, one of the things that I've realized over time is when we talk about like gender roles and how they're a social construct ideologically, and then men, for example, or the patriarchy says that no, women are inherently this way and that way, and men are inherently this way and that way. If that is so, why isn't the argument made that when men cross over into female roles, like chefs and things like that, the best chefs in the world, technically speaking, are men, or are so thought, and women are usually regulated to cooks instead of chefs, and other things like that. So when we think of this, why isn't this argument used that, why is it that when men cross over into traditionally female roles and jobs, they're heralded as being these amazing figures of greatness, that they can do all of that, but when women do the same, they're relegated to being bossy or whatever. So, food for thought.
Any other questions?
Actually, I want to add a bit to that question. Also, there's this thing where males, when they cross to female, usually like hairdressers, for example, this is something I've noticed in the society, like they would prefer to go to a male hairdresser than a female hairdresser, or a male doctor, like a gynecologist, rather than a female gynecologist. Why do we see this happening all around us? This is not only in this society, it's kind of mostly in this society I've observed in other Arab countries as well. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to, the last question.
It's okay, I'm loud enough. Actually, I just wanted to kind of talk to a lot of the things that were brought up, specifically about implicit bias. My name is Sara. I'm actually one of the speakers tomorrow. I'll be doing a workshop, and a big part of this workshop, I'm going to be talking about implicit bias, which is inherent in your comment and your comment as well. So I'd like to invite people to come in. It's sold out, but we'll sneak in some people.
What's popular at what time?
It's at 10:30, and then it goes on to 1 p.m. And we're going to be actually talking about, I think the person that asked the question about how do I respond in these kind of situations, this is what the workshop is going to be for. So we're actually moving towards more of a solution and a strategy and how we're talking about these things.
Okay, thank you. So an advertisement for tomorrow's talk. Please take note. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to try to answer your question. Actually, I want to ask you a question first and then try to answer it. We also see the opposite, that when women do cross over to male professions, these automatically become devalued. For example, now we see a lot of women in the HR position in Lebanon, and you see the HR position is really like devaluated and pays much less than the CFO, for example, position. Even in academia, when we see more women entering, into academia and becoming professors, the profession itself becomes a little bit devalued. So why does this happen? It's because of the implicit bias where, think manager, think male, where masculinity is still perceived to be superior in terms of assertiveness, in terms of competence, in terms of getting things done. And because of socialization, and here I'm going to perhaps step on the sociologist, women are socialized, such as men, to believe that, and that's why we see that in our classrooms. I was talking to a professor the other day when they want to decide who the leader of the team is. Often, if it's 3 females and 2 males, often the females suggest that the male be the leader of the team. So this is still happening.
I just want to also add to your point, Fida, that the sort of restraints, we've all been talking about this, but the sort of restraints are very much structural. And I always find this analogy very helpful to me. I don't know if it'll be helpful to others, but it's like a chess game where one of the pieces of the chess game is allowed only to move certain spaces, whereas others are allowed to move all across the whole board. And so it's not just an individual restraint against women, it's also a structural part of, as you said, religion and several other aspects also. So.
We've got to go now, but if anybody wants to hear about where sexism started, we started off with women's bodies 35,000 years ago. That's where I've got to go now.
Okay, thank you very much. And there'll be a break afterwards so we can continue the discussion.